Hi, everyone. Welcome to our next installment of our Race in Russia lecture series. We're very excited to have Professor Walke here from University of Washington. And, last time we talked about the 19th century. I think right now we're moving a little bit closer to the 20th century. I'll give you just a brief biography of Dr. Walke. Her current research is in a long aftermath of the Nazi genocide in Belarus. She's an associate professor of history in the Department of History and also in the Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies and in International and Area Studies. I guess affiliated with all of these. Her PhDs from the University of California. Is it UCLA?
No, it's Santa Cruz.
No, Santa Cruz. It did not have all the details. And her book, Pioneers in Person, Oral History of Nazi Genocide in Belarus. And without further ado, I will give you Anika Walke.
Well, welcome. Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining me here virtually. I have to say it's quite interesting to do this over Zoom because there's people zooming in where I'm pretty sure that they're not in Kansas right now. So it's exciting what Zoom does to our lives in our professional networks. I think it's very interesting. So I'm very excited to participate in this series of talks on the role of race and the Russian imperial and the Soviet society, because I think we haven't thought about that well enough and not long enough for a long time. And what I'm going to talk about today is actually part of a project that I started a few years back after finishing the book that was just mentioned on the Nazi genocide based on oral histories, because I was really trying to understand the long-term legacies of Soviet internationalism, of the idea of Soviet internationalism in the Soviet context, especially after some of the developments that became so dramatic and tragic in the late 1990s, when more and more violence against people from the non-European parts of the former Soviet Union, but also from abroad, against Black people, Africans, and in particular, were committed. And so this project is not kind of in my current focus, but I've spent quite a bit of time thinking about those issues for a long time, and at some point went to the archives, conducted several interviews, but it is a somewhat contained project, which we'll talk about today a little bit. So, quote, "Where do you come from? Where did you get burned like that? Can I touch your hair? Such horrible questions. I had a hard time there." Frustration and anguish are palpable as Tefera Vassia describes in an interview his experiences of living in Tolyatti, an industrial town in the Samara Oblast. The young man had come from Ethiopia to study in the Soviet Union, and after graduating in the early 1990s, moved with his Russian wife to her hometown in the new Russian Federation, Tolyatti. But finding the exoticization unbearable, the couple returned to Moscow and has lived there ever since. Roughly 10 years later, Ozar Zemba, who had left Senegal to study in Russia, was shot and killed in St. Petersburg in April 2006. Since then, violent attacks against Blacks are committed with increasing frequency. In addition to being beaten up, dark skin solicits street harassment, discrimination in employment and housing markets, as well as institutional hostility. And such experiences are unfortunately widely shared not only by foreign students, but also by asylum seekers and refugees who enter the Russian Federation. So these two responses to foreigners, on one hand exoticizing the other in racist violence, on the other hand, seem to belie Soviet efforts to implement ideas of internationalism and, quote, friendship of the peoples, that among others guided the invitation and recruitment of international students, especially from African countries, to the Soviet Union. Are these experiences of othering and violence after the breakup of the Soviet Union the result of the breakdown of the Soviet framework? Or are they indicative of an inherent failure of the Soviet framework? of the Soviet framework, of Soviet policies. And I'm asking myself that question because non-Europeans and non-whites had represented the most exploited and most discriminated against populations in the Marxist-Leninist framework, and were therefore invited to come to the Soviet Union to overcome this status, especially this invitation was extended in the late Soviet period. So looking at their experiences and how Soviet citizens perceived this encounter may help us understand the lived reality of internationalism and people's friendship, and whether these two central tenets of Soviet ideology help destabilize racialized hierarchies or curb racial violence. Encounters between Soviet and foreign students are frequently portrayed as problematic and emphasize tensions, but on the other hand, foreign students' memories of their experience in the Soviet Union are often very positive. Similarly, people born in the Soviet Union, among them the adults with whom Vasily and Semba would have interacted, were brought up in the spirit of internationalism and often identified themselves as internationalists. Political and media discourse in formerly Soviet countries, however, feature a widely accepted anti-immigrant rhetoric that is riddled with racial stereotypes, xenophobia, and violent imagery. So these contradictory tendencies raise the question whether internationalism, as it was discussed in the Soviet Union, was or could be anti-xenophobic or anti-racist, and therefore offer a different way of addressing human difference and inequality. And I think to be anti-racist here would include a prohibition of discrimination against people based on their difference, but it would also actively work against the self-set task of creating a general idea of man, of establishing a universal standard for humanity that can only result in a hierarchization of human beings ranked in relation to that universal ideal. I'm drawing here for this discussion or this conception of anti-racism on Etienne Balibar's work and his emphasis on the inextricable links between differentiation, universalism, and racism, which I think proposes to look for practices and structures that presuppose and reinforce difference, operating on images of superiority and inferiority. This lens, I think, will be productive to analyze late Soviet policies on international education and integration, and to see whether there truly was an effort to create relationships of equality that would allow for true friendship to emerge. So in essence, or in other words, what I try to do is to evaluate Soviet policies and practices on the invitation and inclusion of students from African countries with a focus on how race, the category that figures prominently, albeit implicitly in all these analyses, operated, and whether it can serve as a useful tool to measure Soviet policies against their stated goal to create a society of equals. I draw on institutional records, some memoirs, and interviews with alumni of Soviet institutions and universities. And I really look into the everyday life experiences of these young men and women who came to the Soviet Union to study. And on the other hand, I'm also trying to understand the lives of Soviet citizens who lived, learned, and worked with people from areas of the world that they, in turn, would never see. So my research has shown that contrary to the commitment to egalitarianism, forms of differential treatment in terms of housing, stipends, and even education created new hierarchies and resentment that essentially stood in the way of a truly anti-racist friendship, replicating Soviet concepts of fixing national identities and collectives that in turn enabled hierarchies and marginalization. In tandem with pop cultural representations of, quote, Africa as a place of seduction, laziness, but also carefreeness, which of course sharply contradicted the lives of Soviet citizens, these policies helped maintain a problematic relationship. Tendencies to claim superiority and victimhood identified for the post-Soviet context are therefore visible already in this stage of the late Soviet Union and essentially operate against ideas of international solidarity. So in what follows, I'm going to try to illustrate this tendency and those trends by, again, drawing on a number of materials and try to give us a good sense of the everyday life experiences, the encounter between Soviet citizens and foreigners from abroad, specifically from the African continent. So when we're looking at this everyday encounter, we're of course looking at a context which was highly ideologically overdetermined, because since the October Revolution in 1917, the Soviet Union perceived itself as a distinct cultural space that is defined by the active implementation of equality and peaceful cohabitation, suggesting essentially a renunciation of colonialist and imperialist racism that had been used to subjugate individuals and peoples. So I think here the idea of proletarian internationalism really propagated the notion of something different, of a different society. And in many ways, the following policies of inviting students, activists, workers from around the world to study in the Soviet Union, for instance, in the Communist University of the Tatars of the East in the 1920s throughout the late 1930s, the World Festivals of Youth and Students in 1957 and 1985, all served this purpose to kind of show this different idea, this different society in which these values are being implemented. But then in 1958, the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union began to be much more strategic about how to not only increase the influence of the Soviet Union in the countries of Asia and Africa, but also, of course, by doing that, increasing the reach of Soviet politics into these newly liberating countries. And one ways, and some of the ways in which this was attempted was by increasing the number of students and doctoral students from Asia and Africa at Soviet institutions. So specifically organizing campaigns to attract more students from these countries that were either newly decolonized or in the process of decolonization, and to bring them into Soviet universities, where they would learn not only technical skills that would be helpful for their developing economies, but also combine that with political instruction. So with the spread of ideas of scientific socialism and Marxist-Leninist ideology. And so one of the very concrete results of this attempt was the establishment of the University of the Friendship of the Peoples, named after Patrice Lumumba, founded in 1961, in which thousands of students from these newly developing countries would be studying until today are. The university still exists, and people from outside of the outside of the Russian Federation still are being drawn to this university. So on one hand, what we're looking at when we're looking at the foundation of this University of the Friendship of the Peoples, and the kind of broader campaigns to recruit people to come to the Soviet Union, we're looking at a very politicized attempt that seems very institutional and reflects kind of larger Cold War politics. But I think the resulting encounter actually had the potential and the capacity to turn this vision of an internationalist solidarity and intercultural exchange into lived reality, because it really did produce these interpersonal encounters in the streets of Moscow, St. Petersburg, Kharkiv, Donetsk, and elsewhere. So what did this encounter look like? What was this built on the foundations of internationalism and friendship? Were there any other elements and social factors that we should take into account when we try to understand either the success or the failure of international nationalist policies in the Soviet Union? That's kind of my question. What did this encounter look like? How did foreigners and Soviet citizens interact? And I do that essentially in an attempt to make this ideological framework, internationalism, the friendship of the peoples, operable as objects of analysis. And I do that by asking seemingly banal questions about how did people live, how did they cook, who did they live with, how did they travel, and so forth. Because I think that this everyday level enables us to reconstruct the very conditions under which internationalism was implemented. And I think in that sense can also tell us whether it actually operated successfully or not. So first, the motives for international students to come to the Soviet Union was deeply embedded in the fierce competition between West and East. And I'm using these broad terms here really just to simplify the situation. Of course, I think we're all in the process of reevaluating these categories. But I think in a way, the attempts of students from Somalia, Ghana, Nigeria, and Kenya to travel to the Soviet Union very clearly showed the way in which both the Soviet government, but also Western governments like the United States or Great Britain were actively involved in attracting these people and literally often sometimes also stopping others from doing so. So there were a number of moments in which students or potential students from these countries were unable to enter the Soviet Union in legal ways. And therefore the Association for the Friendship, the Association of Organizations for the Friendship and Cultural Exchange with Foreign Countries, which I'm going to for short call Association for Friendship, was designed, it was a non-governmental organization in the Soviet Union, although of course that term is a contradiction in terms in the Soviet context. But this organization, which was not the exact same as the state, as the government, was more and more involved in organizing visas and organizing passports for students who attempted to travel to the Soviet Union, because otherwise students in these countries might have been in a situation where they would not be able to receive a passport or leave the country legally, but by working through kind of non-governmental channels, the students were able to do so. And that was important. Again, a number of students were quite concerned about being under surveillance and being stopped from their endeavors and as they were attempting to travel to the Soviet Union. On the other hand, the Cold War context very concretely applied when some of the diplomas that were issued by Soviet universities were not recognized in these home countries. So especially in countries in which the national liberation movement had not succeeded yet, but was on the verge of doing so, many students found themselves essentially with useless diplomas. And the Soviet government made quite a number of attempts to convince these countries to recognize these degrees. But so just looking at travel, looking at the recognition of degrees actually shows the extent to which the Cold War, so the larger geopolitical tensions around the Soviet Union, really impacted the everyday situation and success of foreign students in the Soviet Union. So, but despite these challenges and obstacles, thousands of students came from African countries to the Soviet Union. Between 1959 and 1961, there were more than 500, but by the end of the 1960s, there were about 5,000. And in 1980, over 15,000. So you can see really over time, there's an increasing number of foreign students in the Soviet Union. It actually continued even after perestroika, after the breakup of the Soviet Union, and picked up even more so in recent years. So I've looked based on some interviews, specifically with a number of alumni who came pretty late, so in the 1990s, to the Soviet Union, at the conditions, and found that many of the elements that really are part of a student's life, living in a dorm, receiving a stipend, traveling for vacation, living together with other students, produced a number of situations in which the intercultural encounter became problematic or was made problematic, might be a better way of saying it. For instance, foreign students, like all other students from abroad, were only allowed to receive packages to the maximum of 10 kilograms per weight per quarter, which for many of them seemed like a limitation on their ability, for instance, to cook the food with the spices that they valued, that were part of their cultural and national identity, and which they tried to maintain. And that was also reflected in limitations to clothing, for instance, that they were allowed to bring. So there was certainly an attempt on the Soviet side to limit the number of goods people were able to bring into the country in order to not create kind of discontent between foreigners and locals who might become jealous. That was an actual concrete fear among Soviet officials. But it also had a negative impact on the way in which foreign students perceived themselves or perceived the ways in which they were allowed into the country and how they were allowed to organize their lives. On the other hand, several problems, and that came up in a number of interviews and also in some of the archival material, was the situation in the dorms, where most students were placed together with one Soviet student only, and realized very quickly that in most cases these Soviet students were those who were kind of the most loyal to the party, were successful, respected members of the party or the Komsomol. And so there was this constant suspicion that this was really just a mode of surveillance rather than actually bringing them together with other students, and certainly didn't necessarily increase the enthusiasm about their living situation. On the other hand, several students pointed out in the interview that often these were the only Soviet citizens and Soviet students that they interacted with on a regular basis, because they were the only people who talked to us. It's literally a quote from the interview. They went to go shopping with us. They showed us around the city that we lived in. So there seems to be quite a systematic limitation, actually, to people's ability to interact with other Soviet students. So in that sense, the everyday encounter was actually somewhat limited. I think that's a first conclusion that is very important here, because that certainly shows that the internationalist or the intercultural encounter was not only perhaps not successful, it actually didn't actually take place in many instances. On the other hand, and for some of you who have been working on this history, this might be a familiar criticism, is that often Soviet students felt that the foreign students were accommodated under better conditions, had newer furniture, had more space, were put in designated floors that had been specially renovated, so that they felt like that there was distinction being made between these foreigners who came to the Soviet Union that they perceived as unfair. And especially that was only exacerbated by the fact that exchange students received higher stipends than most of the Soviet students, which allowed them to buy different kinds of food, but which also provided them with better opportunities for travel, even within the limitations that were placed on these foreign exchange students. They had more kind of expendable money that they could use for recreation, relaxation that Soviet students didn't necessarily have access to. So there was a feeling of resentment toward exchange students that was pretty widely reported on, and is pretty widely reported on in much of the literature on the issue, even though it is, of course, still somewhat limited. Last but not least, I wanted to point here to some of the other attempts that Soviet institutions made to facilitate international internationalist, intercultural encounter between Soviet students and foreign students. One of them was, for instance, the organization of vacations or recreation in the summer months, so during the study breaks, where students were encouraged to travel to collective farms or cooperative farms, kolkhoz or sovkhoz, to help with the harvest, to help with farm work, but then also had major parts of the day essentially free to themselves, where they could go swimming in the lakes and kind of recover and relax after a year of intense study. But it turns out, and this is primarily based on our archival research that I've actually done, of very critical reports from the Komsomol itself, that in many instances, very few Soviet students actually took on this offer and participated in these quote-unquote vacations, which of course was a combination of work and vacation. But that on the other hand, they were often also very poorly organized, and accommodation, lodging, food were often of very poor quality, and so didn't necessarily seem very attractive either to foreign exchange students or to the Soviet citizens itself. So that even though there was an attempt to organize this encounter and provide conditions for that encounter, it couldn't actually succeed because there was not enough resources put into this. So, and another moment in which I think that internationalist or that intercultural encounter failed was the attempt to create essentially these so-called interclubs, so clubs or other kind of events, venues in which foreign students and Soviet students would talk about their different cultures, their histories, get to know each other. That often there wasn't translation provided, that often it wasn't well announced, the attendance was very low. So that, again, there was an attempt to provide a venue for that encounter, but it didn't succeed. It was primarily an attempt and probably more an object of propaganda. So last but not least, I want to just talk about here about the treatment that some foreign students received individually from some of the officials, because I think that interaction between individuals and Soviet institutions, Soviet authorities, is also quite indicative of a somewhat problematic encounter that specifically shows, for instance, in moments when students complain, when they file complaints, when they criticize how they are treated, or when they criticize very concrete conditions, experience that they have. There was one case that I found, a student, Yusuf Baro, who had traveled to Yalta during the summer of 1963, lost his wallet and essentially asked local police and local institutions for help to get home because he'd lost all his money, didn't have a place to go. And he would essentially was told that he should just be grateful for all the support that he has already received in the Soviet Union, and otherwise he should just go home back to Senegal. So there certainly was this notion of we're doing so much for you and you're not even grateful, you're still asking for more, which I think is of course very indicative of not necessarily very generous relationship, but it also puts into a different perspective, I think, a number of the overall effort to recruit and to mobilize foreign exchange students to come into the Soviet Union. That here is more represented here as a burden, as something that they don't necessarily do for its own sake and because it appears important. So if we're looking at that and some other moments that I was able to reconstruct based on especially some interviews about relationships between individuals and Soviet officials seem quite problematic. when, for instance, some minutes from meetings also talk about the fact that some Komsomol officials talk about a kind of a slave mentality that foreign students, especially from African countries, would have, and that they would have to overcome. That has to be worked with so that they really recognize the value of communism and need to be treated differently, in other words, than other students. On the other hand, there was several stories about relationships that I think come back to this moment of exoticizing the other, when especially in the aftermath of the 1957 World Festival, most Soviet citizens expected kind of, and this is a quote, more oppressed, beaten down, or suffering people, but then realized that they were actually quite smart, educated, and well-groomed. And even staff members at the Institute for African Studies, some of which I was able to interview at the the former Soviet Academy of Sciences, recall their own astonishment and describe the incoming students in ways that are, I think, very much indicative of deeply rooted biases and stereotypes, highlighting the unexpected level of education and mannerisms alongside, quote, typical African behaviors and features of a very sinuous body, for instance, where the person was described as kind of walking half dancingly, and not as straightforward, or in other words, civilized as Soviet citizens would do. So there really was this impression among Soviet citizens of an other, of a person that does not belong, that is very different than Europeans, and really also challenges some of their own preconceptions and expectations about what that other would look like. And I think this is where the exoticization that I described at the very beginning of this talk, I think was very deeply and wide spread and deeply ingrained in the ways in which Soviet citizens expected foreign students, especially from African countries, to appear. So, in essence, I think if we try to summarize that, some of the statements of Soviet officials about the Black students who come with this kind of inferiority complex, meaning the slave mentality, but also the ideas about certain kind of bodily features that facilitate a certain kind of bodily behavior, always kind of refer, I think, to deeply ingrained notions of different races and the ascriptions that are made toward these bodies, and therefore essentially made it impossible for these foreign students to become equal or to be seen as equal to Soviet citizens, Soviet students. And in that sense, the attempts to provide particularly good conditions for these students by giving them better housing, giving them better stipends, and so forth, actually kind of backfired in a way, because they only contributed to externalizing these students to making them appear as different, as a special group that needs to be treated in a particular way, and therefore kind of worked actually against that notion of overcoming differences, of creating a situation in which internationalist solidarity between equals can actually emerge. And it certainly does not promote anti-racism as I defined it earlier. So really a moment or a way of thinking, a vision that works actively against producing difference and differentiality among human beings. So in one sentence, I think this very brief and very short, I think, survey of Soviet policies on foreign students, I think, showed that the notion of internationalism and anti-racism as they could have been implemented in the Soviet Union, that certainly didn't come to pass. That certainly didn't work out. And to some extent might be actually the foundation for the very problematic racist and xenophobic resentments and sentiments that we see in the post-Soviet context. So I think that's all I have, and I guess we're going to have a discussion.
Let me unmute myself and turn on my video. Thank you so much for that really interesting talk. We really appreciate having you here. And I see that Eric has already put a question on the chat. So for everyone who's either joining us for the first time or is still mulling the really interesting talk, feel free to put your questions in the chat and I will try to read them. And this is one of our colleagues here at KU, Eric Scott, and he thanks you for the fascinating talk. And he says, I was wondering if you think some sense of hierarchy is inevitable when it comes to the concept of internationalism, which recognizes and groups people as belonging to distinct nations as opposed to cosmopolitanism and other transnational forms of identity. I was also curious about how national and racial hierarchies present in the Soviet Union's relationship with the post-colonial world intersected with national hierarchies within the Soviet Union, such as disparities between Russians and people from Central Asia and the Caucasus.
Mm-hmm. These are big questions.
Just multiple, like 6 questions in one.
Yeah, no, that's fine. No, I mean, I think I'm starting with the last question. I'm sorry, I'm also looking at the questions. They're quite long. I think there is definitely a correlation with regard to the national hierarchies within the Soviet Union, especially looking to the non-European peoples that are certainly grouped as other in a very different way than Black people from the African continent. But I think there's also a lot of echoes in the ways in which Blackness and non-whiteness are often grouped together in these conversations. So I did not necessarily pursue a very focused investigation or study of the echoes between, let's say, Soviet nationality policies of the 60s and 70s and the policies directed toward foreign students. Although I think that would be a very fruitful endeavor to really look at kind of the domestic context and the hierarchies within the domestic Soviet context and how that plays out in the Soviet relationship to non-Soviet peoples. That would definitely be a very interesting pursuit, I think. And I think there's actually several grad students and recent graduates have been much more successful in doing that than I am with this more contained project here. As for the inevitable hierarchy within the notion of internationalism, I think if you think about communist internationalism really within the communist context, then yes, I think communism, the communist vision itself, I think, is a hierarchical. I think if at the point that you're thinking about a vanguard party, which is what Lenin did and which is what the Bolshevik Party was, and then was designed to be, I think there is a hierarchy built into communist internationalism from the get-go, because communism itself, I think, works based on a hierarchy in the Soviet framework, because it does not assume that already everybody is willing to build a communist society, but that you need somebody to mobilize people to forge ahead and to promote communist ideas. And so I think internationalism in this context replicates that probably in a particular way. Because the assumption was, of course, that the Soviet Union would be the first to pursue the revolution, and then it would spread out from there. On the other hand, I mean, if you really think about internationalism outside of the communist framework, which there is a strain of thought that does that. I think it could operate without a hierarchy. I think it could operate in a way that assumes that all nations are equal. Right? My little anarchist heart, of course, wants to overcome national boundaries and identities. Period. But that doesn't work. I'm very well aware of that. But so I think there could be a different way in which to consider and conceive of internationalism. Just to make it really short, but of course that's a long conversation. Could be a long conversation.
We have another question that's come up, several actually. Once again, another individual thanking you for your wonderful talk. What has been your impression of foreign students' experiences of language education in the USSR?
Hi, Hila. Hila is a former student of mine. So foreign students' experience of language education in the Soviet Union, it came up in the sense that all the foreign students, when they came to the Soviet Union and did not have sufficient Russian language skills, which for the majority was the case, that they all were essentially put into подготовительные курсы, meaning they had a year of language learning and only minimal education in other subjects, which was primarily perceived as a huge setback because it essentially meant that their actual education for which they came was essentially postponed, so that it added an extra year to the time that they would have to spend in the Soviet Union, and was seen quite critical. There were both in the archive, I found some traces of the dissatisfaction of international students with that requirement, but also in some of the interviews, it came up that people were not happy with the fact that everything had to be in Russian. There was no way of working, let's say, with English language textbooks, for instance, and pursue kind of the subject education in math and physics and so forth in a language other than Russian. So I think in a way it was perceived as a forced encounter with the Russian language and more as a setback. So that's the way in which that came up. I think there would be much more to look into in experiences of how language learning happened in the late Soviet period. Which was probably interesting for all of us who at some point or other studied in the former Soviet Union and also had to take Russian language classes.
Another question, once again, thank you for your talk. You mentioned that most of your case studies and interviews were from the 90s. So I was wondering what kind of difference you would anticipate if looking at earlier examples, such as from the 60s and 70s.
Mm-hmm. So just to clarify, the interviews that I conducted in between 2013 and 2015 with people who had graduated after the end of the Soviet Union, so in the 90s, so who would really come after the breakup of the Soviet Union. And so weren't necessarily part of that Soviet experience in the same way than others would have been. This formerly Soviet students that I interviewed were of a different generation. They really were the ones who had the encounter in the 60s and 70s. Just to kind of make that clear. So what I said about the experience in the 60s and 70s and in the early 80s essentially are primarily based on what I could find in the archive, meaning I looked through minutes of party meetings, of letters that especially foreign students wrote to the Association for Friendship, complaining or praising or asking for certain things. And I think I wouldn't necessarily be able to compare them because they're such different materials that they were produced in different contexts. But I think the general idea that I took away from that was that in the 90s, of course, it was much more open. There was not the expectation for foreign students to assemble in these dissimiliaches, where the national groups, essentially, that they were expected to organize themselves in. And so that the encounter with Soviet citizens, post-Soviet citizens, Russian citizens, white people, took place on a more individualized basis. They were not as organized. And I think that, to my understanding, produced a moment of pre-selection that only the people who wanted to interact with foreign students did so. So certainly in the 90s, I think the encounter was more positive on an individual basis. On the other hand, you of course didn't have the same political context anymore that also worked in a protective way. Right? I mean, if you look at the racist violence that emerged in the 1990s, that did not happen in the 60s and 70s, at least not to that extent. And so I think there's a little bit of a, how do you say that, a reversal between the individual and institutional openness to the presence of the other, if you will.
We have another question. Again, thank you so much for your fascinating talk. I'm interested in social control. What did the Soviets do to manage the social conflicts that you described in your talk? How successful were Soviet authorities in managing these conflicts?
Does social conflict here refer to conflicts between the foreign students and Soviet citizens around privilege and resource? Well, I mean, from what I found, and that's where some of my comments with regard to how officials saw foreign students were quite problematic in the sense that they often downplayed these conflicts and essentially put the blame more on foreign students who were too rash, too demanding, too aggressive, and were essentially told to follow the rules better. If you're thinking about situations in which Soviet students attacked foreign students because they had Soviet girlfriends, and there was some moment of jealousy certainly involved, but I think it was often also about foreign students having access to commodities that they then gave as presents to the Soviet partners, which Soviet citizens couldn't get. That I did not actually found a particular mention of the ways in which officials would have dealt with those. It was really more when there was a moment of violence that the Soviet officials among the Komsomol tried to educate Soviet citizens about the presence of foreign students. But if there were other conflicts that were articulated by the foreign students, that they were often kind of put in their place, so to speak, which I think, again, is reflective of a rather problematic attitude. That certainly also does not reflect the official policies in some ways, right? That were very much about recruitment and welcoming and engaging foreign students in a positive way.
Thank you so much for your answer. And then here, thank you again for your talk. What proportion of foreign students stayed in the Soviet Union after their studies had finished? How much do we know about the experience of these African former students in the USSR, Russia, outside of the university system?
I cannot give you any numbers. Generally, the expectation was that these students would return to their home countries. They were not allowed to leave. The only number I found with regard to, I believe it was the 70s, that were about 10% of them stayed. And most of those who did stayed because they got married to a Soviet citizen, which was generally not allowed. So if people went that way, they were often scrutinized, interrogated quite heavily, and only very few marriages actually were legal, quote unquote, in that context. But that was pretty much the only way for foreign students to remain. But the numbers are very, very low from what I gathered, but I can't give them to you right now. For the two men that I quoted a few times that came in the 90s, I think the number of people who stayed was higher than during the Soviet period, which I think has probably more to do with the situation in their home countries than with anything that would have happened in the Russian Federation. But it's not something I looked at systematically. So again, another research question.
I don't see, does anybody, I don't see any other questions coming up right now. I was going to ask you myself, and I'll take this opportunity, but I was going to ask if, you are focusing on the 90s. What about later? I mean, are you in a position to talk a little bit about kind of how things change? I mean, I know maybe you didn't have opportunity to do as much research in the later periods, but.
Yeah, no, I did not really. I mean, whatever I can say is more based on kind of personal experience. I studied in Russia in the early 2000s. Mm-hmm. And I can say that in the faculty where I was in St. Petersburg, there were very few students from non-white students, let's put it that way. There were quite a few students from European countries after the breakup of the Soviet Union, but I can't say that I saw a lot of students from the so-called developing world as it was conceptualized in the Soviet period. So I think there was a shift. I think there was a shift in who came to the former Soviet Union. And I would assume that a number of people who would have 20, 30 years ago would have come to the Soviet Union went westward, went to Great Britain, went to the United States, is my cursory impression. But again, I did not really look at it. I really focused on the late Soviet and then early post-Soviet period. So.
Interesting. No, thank you. Thanks for trying. It's really interesting to think about it and those shifting balances and what's less appealing. Another question. Thank you so much for your great talk. Could you please share with us any hints about the origins of this kind of institutionalized racism and the internationalist policies in the USSR and in Russian society in general? As Russia didn't have any slavery trade with African nations in the colonial period, as did the West European nations and empires, and empires in the Americas, how can we historically reconstruct the roots of the Russian racism against directed at Black people? Thanks.
I wish I could answer that concisely. I mean, maybe this is a good time to advertise a book, which tries to deal with that question. It's the Ideologies of Race book. Maybe if you've talked about that in the previous talk already, in which actually my work has been published as well, where there really was the attempt to trace understandings of race in the Russian imperial and the Soviet context by looking to, as you rightly say here, there was no slave trade with African nations in the colonial period. There was not the same kind of colonial experience that you would have in the case of Western European countries and so forth. But I think what emerged for me in that investigation was that the notion of Slavic identity as an attempt, or that was attempted to conceptualize as a European identity, really also took place in this colonial context, even though there was no Russian colonies in the same way. Expedition travels into these at that time colonial spaces did take place, and essentially helped conceptualize Slavic identity as a white identity and as a European identity, which I think kind of produced this notion of the different races, the darker races that are different and needed to be treated accordingly within the Russian Empire and later in the Soviet Union. But I'm stepping very, very far outside of my own kind of comfort zone here, and speaking with any kind of authority. But I think the attempt of Russian writers, intellectuals, politicians to make claims for greatness were often very closely tied to the European identification. So where that really comes from, and I think that is something that you find very, very clearly in the communist treatises of the early Soviet period and even before the revolutionary period as well, were the notion that the non-European peoples in the Soviet Union also need to be lifted up, need to be elevated, need to be civilized. And in that sense, I think actually stand in for that colonial other, which then comes to the Soviet Union in the person, in the bodies of these foreign students. So that's kind of my somewhat preliminary, tentative answer to that question.
Thank you. We have another question. Wonderful talk again. Is there any way that you could compare the African students from say the Cuba and other Latin American countries to sort of Asian students such as Vietnam? So basically look at the different type of one's identities.
Yeah, no, I did kind of glancingly look at those experiences when I was especially in the archive as well, and I think in many ways they were very similar. They were very similar in the sense of being patronized by Soviet officials, by Soviet authorities. Less so in the kind of physical attacks that some of the Nigerian or Somali students would report in conflicts, especially with young Soviet men. I can't really tell you where that difference comes from, where that difference in experience is rooted in. Tobias, what's his name? Is a German scholar who's worked specifically on the relationship between the Soviet Union and Cuba. What's his name? I can find it in my footnotes. I can look it up in just a second. So that would be a good source, I think, for that exploration. He really talks about the University of the Friendship of the Peoples as one of the central venues for that encounter as well. So I think, and it's not an exact response to that question, but I think what has happened in recent years when scholars try to get a sense of this relationship between the Soviet Union and the other, they're often very national, very segregated. So I think that more complex investigation, I think, is still to be done. And maybe it is underway. I might not be aware of it at this point.
I think someone has given us the name of this German scholar, and I believe it's Tobias.
Yes. That's exactly what I was thinking about. I do not have a text that talks about the Soviet trope of a slave mentality. This is literally a quote from an archival document from somebody in the office who was working with foreign students at the University of the Friendship of the Peoples. So I cannot give you a text on that.
Okay, and then the next one is, can you give us a comparative perspective as a socialist world, in the socialist world, countries like China or GDR also train students from the third world, and there too conflicts emerged. Is there something specifically Soviet about the treatment of third world students, or rather socialist common denominators?
I mean, full disclosure, I was born and raised in what used to be the GDR. I was 12 when the wall came down. So based on that, I can talk a little bit about that experience, even though I have not systematically studied that, and I certainly did not look at China. I don't speak the languages that would be necessary to do that. But I think based on what I know about the East German experience, I would say it's more the latter, probably. I don't think there's anything specific. No, maybe, I don't know. That might be too stark. But I think it might be more an issue of the notion of internationalism that I think, as in the very first question that came up today, always had this notion of a civilizing mission. Of lifting up other peoples and bringing them into the communist fold or socialist fold, as it actually was. So I would venture to say that the conflicts and tensions that you mentioned here that also emerged in East Germany, but around very similar issues as I've described it for the Soviet context, have probably more to do with the more kind of patronizing view of the other than a specific Soviet approach to that question. But I'm contradicting myself slightly here with regard to the response about the notion of race in the Russian imperial and Soviet context. So it's somewhat murky, I think.
We have one more question. We're closing in 5, but we'll try. We'll take this one and any other little ones that come up. But thank you so much for your talk. I've heard that Edward Said in his book Orientalism quoted someone who studied in the USSR in the 50s. I can't remember the name off the top of my head. Is there any research on how students from Africa and the Middle East who graduated from Soviet universities contributed to decolonial or post-colonial discourses? Did any of them contribute?
I mean, I think that would only be able to trace by looking at people who contributed to the decolonial or post-colonial discourse and see where they studied. I don't know how else we would be able to trace that. And I have not done that. I do think there was somebody who did study in the Soviet Union and then, yeah, I don't know. That's a great question.
Yeah, I mean, you're getting quite a few, a broad range of questions.
Right, which is great. I mean, I'm really excited. And Rossen, I think, has another question here.
You want to read it yourself? Okay.
I don't know if everybody's reading the chat. Should I read the question? Sure. Yours is, well, your main criticism of Soviet policy towards non-white students is differential treatment, which created resentment within the host society. But wouldn't the alternative be a race-blind treatment that does not acknowledge the specificity of these students' needs and circumstances? That's a big question. I think some of the privileges that I described, I think, were not necessarily necessary. I think some of those stipends, I mean, they had the same opportunity to go buy food as Soviet students. So I think there could have been a different way of handling that. But I mean, this on the other hand, you can of course say, well, they have no family support. They cannot rely on family networks that Soviet students would have that would supply them with additional goods or food or whatever was needed. So it was good to give them a little bit of extra. So I think there's just different ways of looking at that. I think what the issue here is more the way it was presented to the larger Soviet population. And that was also pursued in a context in which privilege and differential access to resources essentially structured the whole of Soviet society, where the nomenclatura received privileges that most Soviet citizens did not have access to. And I think the notion or the the thought connections that people made was then to say, oh, these foreign students are like our leaders, are like our elite that lives much better than we do. So I don't know how to solve that. I mean, I don't know what could have been done to say this is not the case at the point that Soviet society functioned in that way, if that makes sense. Because then they would have to self-criticize their own system of privilege. So I don't know if a race-blind treatment really would be a good alternative here, because as you said, it actually does not necessarily acknowledge particular needs and circumstances. I think there is a deeper problem involved here that I think brings us to considering and analyzing critically the hierarchies that exist within Soviet society and in which the foreigners were placed into. Based on their race, so that it kind of perpetuated that system of privilege and hierarchy, and on the other hand, also perpetuating their racial othering, if you will. So it kind of works both ways. But it's a question I will ponder a little bit more, because I mean, as I said, I'm not deeply involved in researching this particular issue right now. But it is still on my mind, and I would like to kind of pursue that a little bit further in the future. And I think many of the questions that you gave me here today certainly indicate that there are more questions to ask. So I will definitely do that. So thank you all for those questions.
Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for your fascinating talk. And yeah, I think with that, and you were getting some love on the chat.
Yeah, it's really fun to see people who studied here who I know otherwise. So great. So thank you again for inviting me. This was great.
And hopefully we'll invite you again in person. I mean, you are quite close to.
I'm not that far. Yeah, I should actually correct. You said University of Washington. I meant Washington University in St. Louis. Just for the record. They're always confused. So.
They always get. I know it's like Kansas University, which is like not the same thing as University of Kansas. But so I appreciate that. I don't think I had a preset biography, unfortunately. So I was winging it a little bit.
That's okay.
Did the best that I could. But thank you so much, and thank you to everyone for joining us. And we have one more of these coming up before the end of the month. So thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.